Okay, the title for the talk now is going to be Einstein talking nonsense drives people insane. I'm going to look at an example of Einstein driving a person insane. And this is from the book Einstein's Mistakes by Hans C. Ohanian. Where is it? There you go. I've got the book here. And he's got citations there. He's got a John Bocchio, Department of Physics Astronomy, Swarthmore College, David Goodstein, California Institute of Technology, Spartian from the Department of Physics, University of Vermont. So it's various other physics people giving their little word to his book. That's that one. It's Hans Ohanian. There's a professor, I think, of physics. Right. Now, Ohanian's point of view is that Einstein made lots of mistakes, but he's a genius, and that led him to the right answers. So Einstein got the right answers even though he made lots of mistakes. My point of view, yes, Einstein made lots of mistakes, but that leads to nonsense. And we got an example of that. I got it here. Up here. There's Professor Ryden's talk on Einstein being wrong. Is this one? Go back a bit more. Professor Ryden's talk on Einstein being wrong. Professor Ryden, nuclear scientist I believe, and he has looked at the mathematics of Einstein and found it leads to nonsense. And so that's basically my point of view. We've got to go back. My point of view, Einstein, yes, made lots of mistakes, and that leads to nonsense. Right, so, but how Ohanian thinks that numerous mistakes leads to something that makes sense is a delusion. But that's his point of view. So we're looking at Hannigans book, and reduce that, and go back to that. And then some of it, you got a preview of it on the internet. So this is a preview of Hannigans book on the internet. There's little Einstein there. Right. Ding ding. That's the contents of the book. Get down to the preface. This book is a forensic biography that dissects Einstein's scientific mistakes. He deals only tangentially with the mistakes in his personal life, which has already been sufficiently exposed by some of his biographers. So others have dealt with Einstein's mistakes, but mainly in Einstein's personal life. And it does not deal at all with the mistakes that misguided souls imagine they perceived in his theories of special and general relativity. So Ohanian's point of view is that some people are looking at Einstein's theories and they are misguided souls, and they imagine they see mistakes in his theories. But my point of view is no, they are seeing mistakes in Einstein's theories. And one of the mistakes, I'll go back, One of these mistakes here. I've gone into a lot of detail here about one of Einstein's mistakes, mathematical nonsense as used by Einstein's relativity. So that's an example. Right. This is the book, it focuses instead on the missteps that Einstein made in his search for his theories and the misconceptions he had about some of the subtleties of his own creations. So Hannigans claiming that people make a mistake with Einstein, and he's also claiming that Einstein's making mistakes and misconceptions. Einstein's making misconceptions. These mistakes in his scientific work are less well known than the mistakes in his personal life. So this is a fairly recent book, and it's I'll show here again, fairly recent book, and it's admitting now that Einstein made mistakes in his maths and his physics. Whereas before you probably find the Einstein believers saying no, Einstein's a genius, he didn't make any maths and mistakes, he didn't make any mistakes in conceptions and so forth. As Einstein himself said, what is essential in the life of man of my kind lies in what he thinks and how he thinks, not in what he does or suffer. So it's trying to set up a bit of a diversion there. Well, Einstein made mistakes, but try to forget that. The several years I spent exploring Einstein's mistakes were an exciting and enjoyable experience for me. Not, I hope, because of what he translates as gloating, but gloating is a behaviour, whereas literally joy of harm is an emotional. Right, so he's getting rather silly there, talking about the joy he's got from looking at Einstein's mistakes. And get down, he then goes into a bit more detail about how he's looking at the original German and so forth. So here's a list of what he thinks are Einstein's mistakes. In 1905, mistaking clock synchronization procedure on which Einstein based special relativity. And I suppose I'm pointing that out in here, that what Einstein's talking about is nonsense as regards that, I think. 1905, failure to consider the Michelson-Morley experiment. So if you look in Einstein's 1905 paper on special relativity, he doesn't seem to mention the Michelson-Morley experiment. And 1905 again, he would make the mistake in the transverse mass of high-speed particles. That again is in his 1905 paper on special relativity. Still 1905, multiple mistakes in the mathematics and physics used in calculation of velocity of liquids, from which Einstein deduced sizes of molecules. So that's not the special relativity paper. And then it's 1905, mistakes in the relationship between thermal radiation and quanta of light. That's probably his photoelectric paper. And then in 1905, mistake in the first proof of E equals mc squared, and that's his paper he gave on E equals mc squared, so it's a mistake in making that. Then he goes on, 1906 to 1907, he makes mistakes in the second, third and fourth proofs of E equals mc squared. And then in 1907, he makes a mistake in the synchronization procedure for accelerated clocks. So in 1905, he makes a mistake for clocks here, which was in the context of special relativity, when they wouldn't be accelerating. And then in 1907, he makes a mistake when you're dealing with accelerated clocks. And 1907 onwards, he makes mistakes in the principle of equivalence of gravitation and acceleration. And 1911, he makes a mistake in the first calculation of the bending light. And 1913, mistake in the first attempt at a general theory of relativity. 1914, mistake in the fifth proof of E equals mc squared. He likes to make mistakes with that equation. in 1915, mistake in the Einstein-de Haas experiment. 1915, mistakes in several attempts at theories of general relativity. 1916, mistaken interpretation of Mach's principle. So you're getting the idea. That's all he's just really doing, is making mistakes. If we get on further on, he's making mistakes in unified theory here from 1925 to 1955. That's 30 years of making mistakes. So we carry on. We're getting now to the issue of how Einstein drives people insane. And we read it. On Tuesday the 24th, 1969, Albert Einstein drove Donald Crowhurst into madness. Now that's quite clever, because by then Einstein is dead, but he's making somebody insane after he's died. Crowhurst was a participant in the single-handed around the globe sailboat race organised by the Sunday Times of London, and he was in one of his, and Crowhurst was in a boat, and he was becalmed in the mid-Atlantic in the Sargasso Sea, about 700 miles south west of the Azores. There was no eyewitnesses to his descent into madness, but we know what happened because he meticulously recorded the events in his logbook. So Crowhurst is recording going mad in his book. On that fateful day, he began to read Einstein's book Relativity, the Special General Theory. So reading Einstein's book on relativity sent poor Donald Crowhurst mad, insane. The book was first published in 1917, just before Einstein became a celebrity, and it explains his theories in more or less non-technical terms. It sold a great many copies, went through 15 editions, was translated into a dozen languages, and is still in print. So I've read this book, and it's nonsense. Most of these copies remained, mostly unread, but like the currently fashionable books by Stephen Hawking, they presumably added some catch to the private libraries of intellectuals and their fellow travellers. So basically it's probably a physics book which people buy. It looks good on their bookshelf, but they don't bother to look at it. Right, Crowhurst had stowed the book and a few others aboard his yacht to while away long boring days with no wind. He was an electrical engineer, and his training in mathematics and physics was certainly adequate for coping with the book. After reading a dozen pages, he came across a paragraph that quite literally blew his mind. Einstein proposed to test the simultaneity of two events, say two lightning strokes, at two widely separated points, A and B, by observing the arrival of light signals from these events at the midpoint between A and B, discussing the travel times of the light signals from the points A and B to the midpoint, M. Einstein claimed that light requires the same time to traverse the path A to M as to the path B to M. Is in reality neither a supposition nor a hypothesis about the physical nature of light, but a stipulation which I can make of my own free will in order to arrive at definition of simultaneity. Now, when they teach Einstein's special relativity, they don't normally talk of it like that. They're normally talking of it as being a postulate or an assumption. So this is not how they're talking about it in the relativity text which they teach the students. So really we're having a clash here between what Einstein is saying about relativity and what the textbooks are saying about relativity. So Crowhurst simply could not believe this. He knew that because of the motion of the Earth, it was by no means self-evident that the speed of light relative to the Earth would be the same in all directions, and he thought it outrageous that Einstein would pretend to settle this question by stipulation. And basically it's right, Einstein is talking nonsense. Einstein just talks nonsense. In his logbook he wrote, this is Crowhurst, I said aloud with some irritation, you can't do that. I thought the swindler, Einstein's a swindler. Then I looked at the paragraph of the author in later years. So he's looking at a photograph of Einstein as Einstein is older. The essence of the man rebuked me. I reread the passage and reread it, trying to get to the mind of the man who wrote it. The mathematician in me could distinguish nothing to mitigate the offending principles, but the poet in me could eventually read between the lines, and he read, nevertheless, I have just done it, let us examine the consequences. So Crowhurst is imagining Einstein saying this, nevertheless I just done it. So Einstein's just made a stipulation and now he wants you to examine the consequences. But Crowhurst attempts to understand the consequences led him down a dissonant spiral into madness. For the next 7 days he wrote some 25,000 words at a furious rate, almost non-stop, taking only occasional short break, perhaps for a nap or a bite to eat. He wrote like a man possessed, frantically filling his logbook with a string of nonsensical, pseudo-scientific sentences such as... So basically, Crowhurst is going insane. He's read Einstein and he's going insane. I introduce this idea of the square root of -1 because it leads directly to the dark tunnel of the space-time continuum, and once technology emerges from this tunnel, the world will end, I believe, about the year 2000, as often prophesied, in the sense that we have access to the means of extra-physical existence, making the need for a physical existence superfluous. And yet, if creative abstraction is to act as a vehicle for the new entity and to leave its hitherto stable state, it lies within the power of creative abstraction to produce the phenomenon. We can bring it about by creative abstraction. He thought about this. He thought that he had discovered the means to impose his free will on the material world, and then he was thereby solving all the problems of mathematics, physics and engineering. So he's going totally insane. So he is unfortunately in a boat race and he's cheating, and he's got time to read Einstein, and when he's reading Einstein it's driving him insane. And this is what Hannigans says. Although Einstein's book was the proximate cause of Crowhurst's descent into madness, the stress of the preceding months was undoubtedly a contributing factor. Early in the race, Crowhurst had recognised his boat was unsuitable to do battle with the violent weather south of Cape Horn, and he decided to win the race by ford. He zigzagged back and forth in the South Atlantic, out of sight of the normal shipping lanes, whereas in the radio transmissions he pretended to sail past the Cape of Good Hope across the Pacific. So basically he's cheating in a boat race and he's having a bit of spare time to then read Einstein's book, and Einstein's book is the thing that's pushing him into madness. Crowhurst was driven into madness by Einstein's assertion that the equality of travel times for light signals in the opposite directions is a matter of free will. But when Crowhurst at first exclaimed that this was not permissible and that it was a swindle, he came close to truth. The equality of these travel times is not a stipulation made by an act of free will, but a hypothesis which is experimentally testable and is found to be valid because of the laws of nature make it valid. In treating this as a stipulation, Einstein made a conceptual mistake. He adopted the right equality, but for the wrong reason. So Hannigans is trying to say Einstein made a mistake here. Crowhurst reads it, reads Einstein, goes mad, and it's the last bit which knocks Einstein's the last thing that knocks him over the edge. My point of view on this, you read Einstein, Einstein's talking a lot of nonsense. And Hannigans is describing it here as a conceptual mistake. Einstein made a conceptual mistake. In theoretical physics, the end does not justify the means. This is Hannigans. The theoretical physics is not only expected to obtain the right results, but is also expected to give us a coherent understanding on how to reach these results. And if you read Einstein, he doesn't do that. Einstein just talks nonsense. Physics is at least as much about understanding as it is about doing calculations, a point that beginning physics students often fail to appreciate. I don't know, it depends what they're teaching. Einstein's misconception about the real meaning of the equality of speeds of light signals in opposite directions was a big mistake. Yeah, a big mistake. And I think it's tied into what I'm talking here, mathematical nonsense as used by Einstein's relativity. It's a mistake, and it's mathematical nonsense. And as we see, he made other mistakes. Einstein made other mistakes. Einstein was a pioneer exploring unknown territory, and such pioneers rarely find the best and shortest path to their goal. Einstein's exploratory paths were often tortuous, with many erratic twists and turns. Well, torturous, yeah, it's definitely torturous. It's torturous nonsense. And the twists and turns, well, he backtracks. He says one thing, says something else, goes round in circles, and just basically talks nonsense. Physicists who followed Einstein into the new territories were equipped with more patience and better mathematical tools, and they built firmer, straighter roads than Einstein's meandering path. Well, I disagree with that. The physicists who came after Einstein just made more mistakes. They just carried on talking nonsense. And I think probably yeah, and what Professor Ryden points out the nonsense they're talking about. So we get back this person who's written this book, Hannigans, thinks they've sorted out the problems with Einstein's maths, but we disagree. A century of such road building has revealed that almost all of Einstein's seminal works contain mistakes. So Einstein's work all contains mistakes. Okay? Sometimes small mistakes, mere lapses of attention, sometimes fundamental failures to understand the subtleties of his own creations, and sometimes fatal mistakes that undermine the logic of his arguments. So, go back here. That kind of ties into here. Einstein didn't know what he was talking about. Where Edward Teller, who's a well-respected physicist involved in the Manhattan Project and atomic bomb and so forth, explains Einstein didn't know what he was talking about. So that ties in with that. So Einstein full of mistakes, fundamental failures, to understand the subtleties of creation. So Einstein dealing with relativity and not knowing what he's talking about. But the examination of these mistakes also reveals they were often highly fruitful. Einstein was able to develop his theories despite his mistakes, and sometimes because of them. He uses mistakes as stepping stones to reach his grand discoveries. We can say of Einstein that what Arthur Koster said of Johannes Kepler, the 17th century astronomer who discovered the laws of planetary motion by tottering along a meandering path on which he stepped from mistake to mistake until he reached his goal. The measure of Kepler's genius is the intensity of his contradictions and the use he made of them. Koestler called Kepler a sleepwalker. He intuitively knew what he wanted to go and managed to get there without quite knowing how. Like Kepler, Einstein was a sleepwalker. So, I think that's it. So I think it's wrong to compare Einstein to Kepler in this instance, because Kepler found the rules of 3 laws of planetary motion, and the way Kepler found these laws, it didn't really make sense. He did blunder away until he got those laws, and it was not Kepler we go by, it is Newton. It's Newton who worked out the law of universal gravitation, which gives Kepler's laws. So Kepler worked out the laws, and it was left to Newton to make sense of that. But whereas with Einstein we have a theory which is nonsense, basically. We don't have a theory from Kepler, we have a theory from Newton. With Einstein we get a theory which is just nonsense. We go down, Einstein's mistakes. Yeah, that was the end of that then. So Einstein makes loads of mistakes, and Hannigan doesn't care. He wants to believe it anyway. And so this is the conclusions he's reaching at the end of his book. Among Einstein's mistakes, the most productive were the 2 that launched his theories of special and of general relativity. His misconceptions about click-clock synchronization led him to introduce the postulate about the constant speed of light. Earlier we've had it pointed out he was stipulating it and not postulating it, which gave him a shortcut to the Lorentz transformations, the length contraction, the time dilation, and a wealth of other new results. Right, so basically the derivation which Einstein gave for those things was nonsense. His mistaken, or at least defective, principal equivalence led him to the discovery of general relativity. And as Singh said, he needed the principal equivalence as a midwife to give birth to the insight that in the presence of gravitation, space-time is curved. Without such a midwife, he might never have thought of such an outrageous thing. So basically, his derivation of special relativity is nonsense, and his derivation of general relativity is nonsense. But if you carry it on with Hannigans' point of view, he still thinks Einstein is right. But it is leading you to nonsense, because people are believing what Einstein is saying. Einstein is making loads of mistakes, and you've still got people who are claiming belief in Einstein's relativity, and they don't realise they are believing what are Einstein's mistakes. They will make claims about Einstein's relativity, and really it's just nonsense that's come from Einstein. So that is basically my conclusion. That's how we get people going insane. I think people do read Einstein and they work out Einstein is talking nonsense. And if you try to tell somebody Einstein's talking nonsense, then other people are not tending to believe you, and you're sort of like getting labelled a crank by these other people. And so it does drive people insane. With the people who believe Einstein's relativity, of course, will say all the people who say Einstein's talking nonsense must be cranks, and the ones who are saying Einstein is talking nonsense, finding the hurdle with the people who believe Einstein's relativity as believing nonsense. And in the case of Hannigan, he's gone into a delusion. He thinks that numerous mistakes leads to something that makes sense, and he's suffering a delusion. And that's what you're up against. If we go back to one of my other videos, this one. Here we go. A faith and delusion. In this video I'll point out there's usually two things that happen with those who believe in Einstein's relativity. There are people who look at Einstein's relativity, can't make sense of it, and the reason they can't make sense of it is because it's nonsense, and so they then develop a faith that other people understand Einstein's relativity and that Einstein's relativity is correct. And I think Hannigan is the person who wrote this book. Hannigan is an example of a person who has deluded himself. They delude themselves that that Einstein's relativity is correct. So that's the type of person you're up against. Those who have faith and those who have delusions. And in the case of Hannigan, even though he recognises Einstein made lots of mistakes, and these mistakes, the people who have the faith don't really understand what they're talking about, we'll start talking about. He thinks Einstein's relativity is still correct, even though it's full of mistakes. So those two type of people are acting as a block to advancement of science. Thank you.